You know, to hear many audiophiles talk over on the internet, so I guess right here, you would be forgiven for thinking that the most important thing that you could consider for your hi-fi or head-fi system is the music format that you choose to listen to. So over on forums and Facebook groups, you'll hear people say things like, nothing beats the sound of vinyl, or that CDs are criminally underrated, and I'm definitely guilty of that one. Or that high-res audio is the gold standard of streaming music, and that MP3s are complete garbage.
This episode is brought to you by Primare's new SPA25 Prisma, the home cinema integrated amplifier designed for both music and movies. Go to primare.net for more information.
Welcome back, everybody. Yes, I could take my recent copy of Talking Heads to Stop Making Sense. This is the new version from 2023. I could hold this aloft and say, this is by far the definitive version of this album. And I would be not quite correct. And it's got nothing to do with the fact that the cover is much plainer than the original, or that there's no gatefold here, or that the albums themselves come in paper liners. There is a booklet in here, actually. There's a booklet that looks like this. And this was issued, I think, with the original album in limited quantities. I've got a copy here somewhere, actually. So if I put this down, one of these, I've got a couple of original Stop Making Senses here. Actually, if I take this out and this out, I think in this one, there is a booklet somewhere. I have to shake it loose. There we go. So that's the booklet from the original. This is the booklet from the 2023 version. This one's thicker because it's got extra liner notes from the 4 members of Talking Heads. So essentially in this video, I want to talk about Stop Making Sense in order to highlight why focusing on the format with which music is delivered to your hi-fi or head-fi system is a bit of a fool's errand. Now, many people will already know that Stop Making Sense is often regarded as the greatest rock movie of all time. It's not really a documentary, it's just a film of Talking Heads' show that was filmed in mid-December at the Pantages Theatre in Hollywood in 1983. It was directed by Jonathan Demme, but it was shot by Jordan Cronenweth. Cronenweth? Can't even talk today. And so in 1984, the movie Stop Making Sense was released, and it was given a movie theatre run. And there were 16 songs in that set, and it ran for 88 minutes. And there was an album issued alongside the movie. I'll pick up a copy here. Here's my other copy of Stop Making Sense. You can see it's got the big suit on the cover because the movie is known for David Byrne wearing this big suit in at least, I think it's 2 songs, Girlfriend is Better and Take Me to the River. And this album is a bit unusual because even though the movie had 16 songs, this one only has 9. So this was seen as more of a companion release, and I think this was issued so that people could enjoy it without ever seeing the movie. And I guess that's how I came to it, because I heard this at least 2 years before I saw Stop Making Sense the movie, and I saw Stop Making Sense the movie not in the theatres but on VHS, and I bought it and it was really expensive, and I can definitely remember that it cost me 16 British pounds, which was a lot of money in the 80s. Gee, that's an old man thing to say, isn't it? But the VHS had 2 extra songs. It had Cities and Big Business / E Zimbra, which brought the runtime to 99 minutes. And that's important because when Talking Heads, or rather their label, reissued Stop Making Sense on DVD in 2003 and then Blu-ray in 2009, those 2 bonus tracks which were inserted at the right place, so Cities after Slippery People and then Big Business E Zimbra just before the cut over to the Tom Tom Club, those 2 tracks were relegated to bonus material on the Blu-ray, and they weren't remastered or expanded into like the widescreen format, because obviously the VHS and the Laserdisc were issued in 4:3, and then the DVD and the Blu-ray in 16:9. Now, anybody who's ever spent any time on a hi-fi forum could take a copy of this, the 2LP version of Stop Making Sense, and hold it aloft and go, yes, this is the best version I've ever heard to date. And it wouldn't be too long until somebody would come along and hit them with an au contraire. Like, didn't they know that the surface noise of vinyl was intolerable and there was no need to listen to it anymore? And besides, we can now stream this new version of Stop Making Sense in high res. And why wouldn't anybody do that when that's available? Forget about your vinyl. You see what I mean? This is how these kind of flame wars start. And I have that high res audio version of the new version of Stop Making Sense on my Roon server. It's ready to go. It's 24-bit, 44.1 kilohertz. So that's at least 8 bits more than the CD. Now, curiously, this 2023 edition of Stop Making Sense has yet to come out on CD. Now, that might be because there are already 2 versions in circulation. There is the original version with the original cover, and it has the original 9 songs. But what was really interesting at the time, because I think record labels were trying to really push the CD, they extended, in this case, 7 of the songs' runtime. So that means, in fact, if you go back to the LP version, the vinyl edition, you'll hear that a complete verse and chorus is missing from a track like Girlfriend Is Better. So that's the problem with the original vinyl, is that it contains edits of almost every song, whereas the CD does not. But then, the special new edition that was issued in 1999 contains all 16 songs from the original movie, which is one of the reasons why people are excited about this new vinyl edition, because this contains those 16 songs plus the 2 bonus tracks of Cities and Ezimbra. So you might reasonably ask, why didn't the label put Cities and Ezimbra, or Big Business / Ezimbra, on this CD? Well, that's because even with the original runtime, so even without those bonus tracks, the movie ran 88 minutes. You can only get 80 minutes onto a CD. And the thing about this particular edition of Stop Making Sense is that in order to squeeze those 88 minutes of movie runtime onto an 80-minute CD, they edited a couple of tracks, so we don't hear Byrne introduce the band by name in the middle of Take Me to the River, but I can live without that, that's fine. But the worst thing about this is they've really kind of squished together all the tracks. So as soon as one song ends, the other one starts pretty quickly thereafter, and it sounds like the band are in a real hurry to get through their set. So it's just not really an enjoyable experience to listen to, because it just sounds hurried, unnecessarily so. I don't know why that is, but I don't really listen to that version of Stop Making Sense very often. Whereas the original CD, I do actually play this more often because it was designed to be listened to as a standalone album, and all the tracks were edited in such a way that it had a sort of life of its own beyond the movie, whereas this one tries to kind of mimic the movie, and it's a swing and a miss. Now, possibly one reason why many of us like to champion vinyl or CDs on a forum or a Facebook group is because they're physical formats, and we enjoy physical formats. Or perhaps we like to champion high-res audio, or we like to kick MP3s, or even champion CDs, is because there are numbers attached. So high-res audio is usually 24-bit and then either 48 kilohertz and above, although 24/44.1 I guess technically still qualifies as high-res audio. And then things like 320 kilobits per second for an MP3 is seen as, yeah, I guess an indication of that format's resolution, just as 2496 or 24192 might indicate the resolution of a high-res file. Now, the problem in getting caught up in the physical format romance or the numbers of streaming audio files is that we either choose to ignore or we're unaware of one key factor that influences more heavily, I would argue, the sound quality of what we hear. And that is actually written quite plain on the hype sticker of this new version of Stop Making Sense, because it says in capital letters, newly remastered. And it's the mastering quality of Stop Making Sense in its various incarnations that I want to hone in on in this video. Now, I've listened to this 2 vinyl set, and I've listened to the high-res audio master from which this was most likely cut, or a master very close to that high-res master was used to cut this record. And you can't deny easily that basically this new master is the most detailed sounding master to date. We can hear further into the mix of Stop Making Sense from this version than any other version pretty much that's gone before it. But we must also ask ourselves, what's the dynamic range like? Now, the dynamic range is essentially the volume difference between the loud sounds and the quiet sounds. Now, where mastering engineers like to make their mixes pop more on the radio or when we're listening at home is they tend to pull down the loud sounds and then lift the quiet sounds, so there's less of a difference between the two, and that is therefore called a lower dynamic range. And then obviously a higher dynamic range is where the differences are wider. And very often we can see this when we drag a digital file into a software editor and it draws out the waveform for us. The more dynamically compressed it is, the more black we see essentially, or grey. It's more fleshed out or filled out, whereas if it's less dynamically compressed, we'll see less waveform and more of the background of the software app. Now, many other audiophiles, those not enslaved by format, dogma and idealism, are already hip to this knowledge and they'll choose their music purchases accordingly. But it takes some effort to learn what that dynamic range is, because it's not on the CD sleeve or on the record sleeve. The pressing plant won't tell us what it is. The label doesn't tell us what it is. And the artist won't tell us what it is. So we have to go digging ourselves. Now, fortunately, if we have the music in a digital format, we can use a piece of software called DR Offline Mark II from a company called Mart to measure the dynamic range of a set of files. So essentially a CD rip or a high-res download. So I use that software to measure the dynamic range of a rip of the original CD of Stop Making Sense. And the software returned an album average of 14, which is pretty damn good. That's pretty much as good as it gets, actually, and possibly goes a long way to explaining why when I listen to this album, I hear good dynamics, I hear good contrast between the loud sounds and the quiet sounds, so a better sense of light and shade, if you will. And this is possibly one of the best recordings in my entire CD collection here. And if you want to know what is not great at the other end, so if we're getting down to a dynamic range of 5 or 6, then we're dealing with a recording that's very dynamically compressed and doesn't have that strong sense of light and shade. And it's very tense and nervy to listen to. It's like, it's always loud, and it's not a relaxing experience. Not a relaxing listening experience. And the dynamic range on this version of Stop Making Sense is probably pretty good because this was mastered in the 80s. And that's a full sort of 10 years before what's known as the Loudness wars really got underway. That's where mastering engineers really decided to utilize much more frequently dynamic range compression to make their music pop on the radio or wherever it was being played. So by the time the special new edition of Stop Making Sense came out in '99, the Loudness wars were in full swing. And I measured the dynamic range of this release as a CD rip on a hard drive using the software DR Offline Mark II. And this version has an album average dynamic range score of 11, which isn't terrible actually. It's not too bad considering when this was released. But for reasons that I explained earlier, you know why I don't like to listen to this edition very often. But dynamic range is pretty good. 11's not bad. But we can definitely hear that extra bit of dynamic range compression in this master, although I think this was remixed and remastered for this release, as was the DVD and therefore by association the Blu-ray. But this sounds just a little bit tenser, a little bit nervier. It doesn't sort of breathe as easily as the original CD release. But it's not a night and day difference. It's kind of a small difference there between 11 and 14. But what about this new version, this 2023 edition that it's expanded to its fullest track sequence ever? How does that fare in terms of dynamic range measurement? Here it is here. So obviously I've run this from my hard drive through the dynamic range offline Mark II software, and it scores, actually quite surprisingly, a dynamic range score of 9. So that's more dynamically compressed again compared to the 99 edition, which as we know is even more compressed than the 1984 edition. So we've lost, a good chunk of dynamic range from going through these different generations of remasters. Now this is nothing to do with really how technology has progressed, more how mastering engineers choose to use that technology. And they're much more, I guess, aggressive with or liberal with their use of dynamic range compression than they used to be in the 80s. So this new master of Stop Making Sense dynamic range of 9, yeah, you can definitely hear how it's just a bit flatter. It doesn't have a strong sense of light and shade. It is more detailed though, I cannot stress that enough. So I kind of have mixed feelings about this new edition. Oh, I do have one very big nit to pick with this album, in that whoever decided to master this or cut the master for vinyl, they just thought they just ramp up the crowd noise at the start of each side. But that ramping up takes place literally just before the song starts. So they didn't choose to kind of clear out all the crowd noise as they did with the original Stop Making Sense. They just went ramp up, song comes in. And to me, that sounds a bit shabby. I'm sorry to say it, but obviously we don't have that problem with the high-res download. And just to be clear, once again, it's the high-res download that I measured its dynamic range of the 2023 edition, not the vinyl rip. So to recap so far, the new edition of Stop Making Sense gives us the full 18-song, 99-minute track list as per the original VHS and Laserdisc, but it comes with a fairly healthy dose of dynamic range compression. Whereas if we listen to the special new edition from '99, only available on CD, this one, that drops the 2 bonus tracks. But yeah, it's just still a little bit dynamically compressed, not as much as the 2023 edition, but more so than the original 1984 edition, which only has 9 songs, of which if we pick up the LP, those songs are heavily edited. But wait, there's one more version of Stop Making Sense that we still need to consider. And that's the Blu-ray, because buried on this disc is a high-res PCM stereo version of this concert. It's 24-bit, 48 kilohertz. And about 5 years ago, I got a friend to rip this for me. So I have this on a hard drive as a bunch of files, albeit with Cities and Big Business / eZimbra as 2 bonus tracks, because that's how they were featured on this Blu-ray. So I ran those through DR Offline Mark II, and I got a dynamic range average of 13. That's only just 1 below the original CD, but better than the subsequent remasters in '99 and this year. And that goes a long way to explaining why I still enjoy the sound of the Blu-ray high-res audio layer more than any other version of Stop Making Sense, even the new one. I guess when I say I enjoy more, I mean in terms of sound quality, but we also get the full audio track. So none of the songs have been edited. We get to hear David Byrne introduce the band by name, although we don't get the bonus tracks in the right place, but that's a minor niggle. I can always move those if I need to in my list of songs on my hard drive. But where we get to the spicy finding of this video is if I take, for example, the FLAC rip of this from my hard drive, if I decode it to WAV and then to MP3 and then move it back to WAV, so I've lost some of the lossless nature of the original file, it still sounds better than this version because the dynamic range of the original recording is still retained by lossy compression. Yes, lossy compression has, yeah, it does sound a little bit ragged sometimes with cymbals and hi-hats and maybe very high-pitched instruments. But the dynamic range, the essence of the recording is still retained by that lossy compression. And when I've mentioned MP3s in this video, I've only done that to make it clear that I'm talking about lossy files. I'm really referencing things like Ogg Vorbis that are used by Spotify or AAC that is used by Apple Music in its sort of lossy provision. So I'm talking about all of lossy compression really managing to retain the dynamic range of these recordings. So for me, an MP3 of this sounds better than a FLAC of this. So today's lesson is a sharp reminder that an album's dynamic range will always trump its delivery format, and that an MP3 or an Ogg Vorbis file or an AAC file can still sound pretty damn amazing if the mastering engineer has chosen to maximize as much as possible the dynamic range of that recording. Equally, high-res audio stops making sense when it wraps a compressed master. If you want to analyze the dynamic range of your CD rips on your hard drive, this doesn't work with streaming services, it's only with local files, you can buy the DR Offline Mark II software. I think it's about 50 euros, something like that. If you don't want to pay that, there is a fantastic online database of existing results, and I'll put a link to that website in the description box below, because it really is a fantastic resource. I can't remember the name of the guy that runs that, but he's doing God's work essentially. But anyway, if you liked this video, if you thought it was informative or entertaining or a bit of both, then please give us a like down below. If you like my attitude towards, mastering quality and how it trumps everything else, then please consider subscribing to this channel. And as always, thank you ever so much for watching.